Growing up, way before the success of Games Pass, there were a lot of kids out there that had to make the difficult decision on what their next gaming purchase would be. You didn't have an endless supply of games ready to download, play for 30 minutes and deem it unworthy before moving on to the next one. You had limited funds, so if you bought a game, you had to make a commitment to it. Naturally, I was no exception to this rule, so with a bead of sweat running down my face and a wall of video games towering over me, each one of them clawing at me for my attention, with little more than the box art to go off, I thought I'd play a safe bet. Nothing too scary, nothing too niche, and definitely nothing too challenging. Rayman 1 released in September 1995 as a launch title for the PlayStation 1, and was one of the defining titles for helping to put Ubisoft on the map. Rayman 1 might not be the most groundbreaking platforming title around, but it did well enough to warrant numerous sequels and spin-offs, for better or worse. Is the limbless lad really worth being remembered so fondly? Let's find out as I take a look at Rayman. So the game sees a title character Rayman tasked with retrieving the Great Protoon, an item used to keep the world and its inhabitants in harmony after it was stolen by the creatively named Mr. Dark. It's basically the Unimind from that Buzz Lightyear cartoon in the early 2000s.
We are one.
I must have this mystical orb.
With the world now supposedly in turmoil, Rayman must travel the lands gathering up creatures known as Electoons and assemble them at the Great Protoon to create balance in the world once more. And that's the whole plot, simple as that. I don't play these sorts of games for the story, so I'm not going to hold the plot against it, but what I will say is that it comes across as a bit half-arsed in its delivery. The world is supposed to lose balance when the Great Protoon is stolen, but we have no frame of reference for what the world looked like prior to it being taken, so we can't gauge the severity of Mr. Dark's actions. If this was a standard setting, that'd be fine, but when there's a giant tentacle plant shuffling towards you spewing out Victorian-era explorers, it does kind of warp your sense of reality. And Mr. Dark doesn't even seem to have a motive. Is the Great Protoon meant to grant him power? What benefit does he get from keeping the world unbalanced? Why does he randomly kidnap the fairy that's been helping you, but only after she's finished giving you all your power-ups? Don't know. Even someone like Bowser has clear motives. Sure, they're mostly based around defiling a human princess, but at least the guy knows what he wants. If it wasn't for his insistence on upholding the sanctity of marriage, then Bowser Jr. would already be sharing his toys with his new youngest sibling. But in all seriousness, the plot of Rayman isn't any worse than your average platformer. It's just with a couple of tweaks to a few lines of dialogue, they could have had the story make a whole lot more sense. But story aside, the first thing you'll likely notice with this game are the striking visuals made with over 65,000 colours apparently. I don't exactly know what that means by comparison, but the box is happy to brag about it, and loading into the first level I can soon see why. Every scene has an explosion of vibrancy that manages to capture the essence of Rayman's mystical world, and it truly is a feast for the eyes. Colour, despite being plentiful, is used with enough restraint that it doesn't overwhelm and is continually able to impress throughout its run. Rayman himself is well animated, while the enemies you duke it out with are appropriately wacky. Even though the characters were only designed limbless due to hardware restraints, I still think it works well and gives the characters their own identity. This guy gets my favourite enemy award just for being as bewildered to his own existence as you likely are. But where Rayman's aesthetics truly shine are within the level themings themselves. Platformers so often stick to the generic Mario Bros style that they needlessly shoot themselves in the foot creatively speaking. But in Rayman, where you'd expect a basic grassy plain to lie, you'll find marshlands thick with vines and spiky fruits. The further you go, the denser the forest becomes. Mist starts to creep in as the greens and yellows take a deeper tone. Eventually it all comes to a head as floodwaters sweep through the stage as you climb to safety, and all of this is just in the first zone. By the second area, the conventions have clearly gone out the window as Bandland sees you gliding down musical staves as giant sleep-deprived eyes shoot lightning bolts at you. Maracas propel you upwards like rocket ships, while tucked in the clouds you'll find monks juggling orbs you can use as platforms. It's weird, and that's what makes it so wonderful. It subverts your expectations and makes entering a new zone feel almost magical. I love looking at the map screen and seeing how all these drastically different environments fit together, and I like the detail that it's shown from the villain's perspective as he tracks your progression. Though why they have a giant floating present in the sky when it has absolutely no bearing on the game is anyone's guess. Topping all this off is a soundtrack that manages to combine ambience with typical platforming music. I was genuinely surprised that much thought had gone into a sound design of something with such a kid-friendly vibe. It knows when to be silent with nothing more than the rumbles of thunder in the distance or the winds swirling around a mountain peak to keep you company, and it all works great. As for the soundtrack, yeah, I'll let the quality speak for itself. So the core structuring of Rayman sees him attempting to get to the exit sign across multiple levels in a single zone before moving on to the next. There's the illusion of choice where the map screen occasionally splits off, but you'll need to visit every level at least once for either a power-up or a cage. Cages house the previously mentioned Electoons and act as the game's sole collectible. There are 6 in total for each level, and this is where my first real criticism of the game comes into focus. After clearing the Cave of Scopes, you're told Batilla the Fairy is being kidnapped and you're just left at a dead end on the map screen. The game never alludes to how you should progress, so the only thing left to do is hunt down every cage in the game. Doing so is no easy task either. One of Rayman's main gimmicks is that the enemies and objects will spawn out of thin air when you reach a certain trigger point. Each trigger is accompanied by a jingle sound to alert you in case something has changed just off screen, and I like the mechanic when it's used well. If you see a piece of terrain that looks kind of odd or a trail of tings leading to a bottomless pit, you'll be rewarded for your attentiveness, and those moments feel well realised. But where this becomes a problem for hunting cages is that you'll likely not be able to tell where to start looking. Not all trigger points are noticeable, meaning you could be inches away from a spawn that'll drop the cage right next to you, but you'd have no way of knowing. And since levels are split into sections and there's no tracking power-up, say a big arrow that points to where the cage will be, it can be tiresome shifting through each section. But the thing that takes the piss the most above all else is when you're inches from touching the exit sign and they go and spawn a cage behind you. You little bastards. So it turns out that collecting all the cages does indeed open up the pathway forward to the final area of the game, the Candy Chateau. I find it funny that a villain named Mr. Dark, who's drenched in an all-black outfit, complete with stereotypical villainous cloak, would keep his headquarters in a place that looks like somewhere the Gingerbread Man would own a timeshare. But like I said, subverting expectations and all that. This place is equally as gorgeous to look at as the previous areas, but as the climax of the game, it unfortunately falls by the wayside. Where the other zones are spread out over multiple levels, the Candy Chateau is crammed into just one. And that's a shame since there's some good ideas here. Having Mr. Dark mess with your powers and spawn a copy of Rayman to mimic his moves are interesting inclusions, but we never get enough time with them to really feel the benefit. Each of the previous zones would also add new gameplay elements to keep things fresh, but they were also given enough breathing room to build off of each other. That's not the only problem with the level either. The final boss is painfully underwhelming, being nothing more than a glorified boss rush. You don't even get to fight Mr. Dark, he just throws some magic at you and flies away. Supposedly these bosses are actually Mr. Dark shapeshifting, but no, I'm not buying that. Either way, with the final blow dealt, the game ends just as quickly as it began. Rayman's moveset is a rather interesting take on a basic idea. You can run, crawl, jump and punch as you'd expect, but given the nature of Rayman's design, he's able to throw his fist a short distance like a boomerang. You can charge it for extra range and damage, while Rayman's positioning affects its returning trajectory, allowing for more strategy than simply spamming the attack. There's a satisfying quality to sniping an enemy mid-jump, punching the teeth out of a piranha, or getting a hunter in the back of the head on a returning throw. Over the course of the game, Rayman will slowly accrue the abilities to sprint, hover, swing from hooks and grab ledges. I'd have thought being able to grab a ledge was par for the course for anyone with working hands, but that's the least of Rayman's worries considering the lack of arms and legs. It's fun unlocking new abilities as they work well together and give you new methods for approaching difficult platforming challenges, but the first half of the game is painfully slow while acquiring these, particularly since sprint is the last to be unlocked. Overall, I like Rayman's controls, and it can be fun chaining together a sprint jump with a well-placed throw of your fist to pull yourself across large gaps. But I have to admit there's a certain amount of niche to the control scheme that can be frustrating to master. Rayman's jumping is oddly floaty, and when jumping left or right he's locked into that direction, making corrections difficult to do. Throwing a punch in the air automatically gives it maximum damage and distance, making the charge up completely redundant, while the ledge grab gives you a full height jump and the sweet spot for letting go of a hook isn't at the peak of the swing. But the icing on the candy chateau cake is Rayman's rather dodgy hitbox. I'm not saying that all of these mechanics are bad, some of them I think are rather endearing. It's just with a limited life system and punishing level design, you really need to know these mechanics well before expecting to make any serious progression. And that segues nicely onto what Rayman's most notably remembered for. Underneath the childlike aesthetics lies a killer of a game, a true wolf in sheep's clothing. It doesn't care what age you are, you either get good or you don't get anywhere. Rayman 1 is a difficult game, that's fair to say, but while difficulty isn't necessarily a negative, I think it has to be done right, and here it can be a mixed bag to say the least. On the one hand, you have obstacles that want you to use your moveset in creative ways. Slippery walkways let you build up speed, requiring you to be quick with your reaction times to reap the best rewards, whereas temporary power-ups can turn your gliding ability into full flight as you're forced down spike-lined passageways. They're smart ways of keeping the core moveset and are able to spice things up in a pinch. But on the other hand, for every positive, you have 3 negatives waiting in the wings. The camera is far too zoomed in, certain level sections are nothing more than a jumbled mess, enemies will literally pop into existence right in front of you, and a few jumps require near frame perfect timing, so much so that they patched them in the PC release. But easily the worst offender of the lot is that god-awful knockback stun. Anytime Rayman takes damage, whether on the ground or in the air, he'll be pushed back. Alone, that's not too bad, but the game is littered with insta-kill pits and narrow platforms, meaning anything that touches you will force you to your death. It's a problem right from the first area, and it only gets worse as the difficulty racks up. Again and again, enemies and obstacles will be thrust upon you where the slightest graze forces you to do the section over. And with an extremely limited life system, any trial and error gameplay of learning the patterns becomes tedious as a game over forces you to do the level again in its entirety. Eventually, tedium turns into complete frustration as a number of small niggling details start to stack up and wear down the experience. From the edge of the screen killing you here, to the top of the screen assisting in killing you here. If you think I'm being unfair on Rayman 1, then I'd like to direct your attention to what is objectively the ultimate cheap shot in gaming history. I think I've made my point. So, Rayman 1. Is it actually any good? Well, kind of. It's a game with a gorgeous art style and sound design complete with wacky characters and unique environments. The controls are fun and hold up well once you get a feel for their quirks, while the gameplay elements are fresh and varied all throughout its run. Finding secrets can feel rewarding, and when the difficulty is done fairly, it feels incredibly satisfying rising up to the occasion. On the flip side though, large sections of the game can be frustrating as enemies spawn out of thin air, there's questionable hitboxes and level design, along with that damn knockback stun pushing you into every insta-kill object in sight. The game is also rather short, with the final area being so underwhelming that it feels like they just ran out of time, while needing to collect all the cages to play it can be a tedious endeavour at best. But the biggest problem with Rayman 1 was just how successful it was, and thanks to its popularity, the world will forever be tainted with these abominations. In truth, I'm rather fond of Rayman 1. I made a commitment when I bought this game, one that I wouldn't do if I was growing up today. I experienced all the highs and lows that come with such a flawed but beautiful piece of media, and for that reason, Rayman will always have a special place in my heart. If you've made it this far, please consider supporting the channel with a like, comment and sub, so I can keep making the content that I love. Thank you for watching, if indeed you still are. Ta-ra!